Our next story is from South Africa. The xenophobia row is escalating. Fellow nations are slamming South Africa over xenophobic attacks on foreigners in the country. And the latest to join the brigade is Mozambique. It says that 7 Mozambicans were killed in South Africa. The incident took place last week on Friday. Mozambique claimed that 5 of these deaths were a direct result of xenophobic violence that broke out in Mossel Bay. And the other 2 people died in a road accident while they were traveling in a private vehicle on their way back to Mozambique.
All right. Welcome to This Week in Africa. As you saw, our first story is the xenophobic attacks or Afrophobic attacks that have claimed the lives of 5. And we have a number of other stories that we'll be going through today. We'll also be discussing the protests in Kenya against the US Ebola facility. We'll be talking about Trump's plans to cut major visa processing embassies across Africa. We'll also be talking about Ghana's vow to never beg for IMF bailouts again, the UAE buying half of Zimbabwe's total exports, what that means for continued sovereignty on Africa. We're also going to talk about the Senegalese president naming 30 new members of cabinet. And if we have time, we will speak to some of the changes happening in Niger. This is your weekly live stream, This Week in Africa, where we talk about all things African news. Before we get into today's stories, we'll start with introductions. So I'll turn it over to you. Introduce myself.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Gloria Ayo. I am the founder and host of Diaspora Station. What we do is we do all we can to connect Africa and its diaspora through news, culture, entertainment, politics, you think of it. I mean, we haven't done much work in that regard, but we're working towards it, so bear with us, but definitely happy to be back.
There it is. And I'm Joe Otagwa. I'm the founder of Authentic African Media. I am in Ghana right now after spending 3 weeks in Sierra Leone. I am now on my 4th week on the continent, and I am in Ghana. I'll be returning to the States very shortly. But I help people visit, move, and invest in Africa. I spend some time, sharing the news of the day around the continent, specifically this live stream. And then we do a weekly live stream focused on all things happening on the continent. And I do a bi-weekly with Ivy Prosper on news in Ghana. And then I do a bi-weekly with Inside the Diaspora and Sierra Leoneans Killing It on news specifically pertaining to Sierra Leone, because those are the 2 countries that I visit the most and where I get the most direct questions about. So our focus is also bridging the gap between those on the continent and those in the diaspora. So with that, we'll get back into today's stories. As you saw at the top, unfortunately, the Afrophobia and violence in South Africa has claimed the lives of 5 Mozambicans. It's really part of what's been escalating in country, triggering fierce diplomatic backlash and emergency evacuations from neighboring nations. Also, Ghana had an emergency evacuation of over 300 people, I think at this point now, or close to 300 people have been evacuated. Some of the protesters on ground have said things such as, countries are overreacting, specifically Ghana is overreacting. But as you can see, the kind of rhetoric that we've heard can potentially lead to these kinds of results. I will play more of the video that we started earlier, and we will have some commentary on the other side.
According to local media, tensions erupted at an informal settlement over allegations that undocumented migrants were being employed by construction companies. Reports say around 55 shacks were torched, with people still inside them. Following the violence, 300 Mozambican nationals had reportedly returned home over the weekend. The government is preparing to repatriate over 500 others from South Africa who have been sheltered in a safe location in the Western Cape province. Though the South African government has confirmed the deadly incident, it says that 2 and not 5 Mozambicans had died. The police said that a South African teenager was also killed under unknown circumstances. Nigeria, too, is preparing to evacuate its citizens. However, in the wake of the anti-migrant violence in South Africa, Nigerian police have been warning the public against launching retaliatory attacks on South Africans in the country.
Reprisal attacks against South African nationals, businesses, or interests in Nigeria will not be tolerated. This is not because their pain is more important, but because Nigeria is governed by law. Everyone lawfully residing in Nigeria is entitled to legal protection. Violence in Nigeria does not protect Nigerians abroad. Such actions would only create additional crises.
Last week, Ghana also repatriated around 300 of its nationals from South Africa, and more such evacuations are expected in the coming days.
All right, we'll leave it there. A lot to discuss there. Hundreds of Mozambicans and many of neighboring countries are repatriating folks. As you saw, 300 repatriated back to Ghana, and Nigeria has also made very specific statements to the public of Nigeria not to have retaliatory attacks, which I think is important. That kind of communication is definitely important. I'd love to see South African politicians take that similar stance. But your thoughts, Gloria, on this story?
Yeah, I completely agree that, you know, having just one country saying, please ensure you're not retaliating is wonderful. But just imagine if it also came from, like you said, the South African government. But this isn't the first time that this will happen to Mozambicans in South Africa. There was a 2015 wave where 3 Mozambicans actually lost their lives, among others. And the president then, Jacob Zuma, traveled all the way to Maputo in Mozambique to issue a formal apology. Zuma offered the apology in the name of a small minority of South Africans who carried out what he called atrocious acts. So I'm giving you an example of when a president took a stand, because, you know, then it was relatively new. So, I mean, it had been happening, but in recent history, that was relatively new. And perhaps it was more shocking then, and the government seemed more responsive. Zuma's government pledged that South African authorities were working hard to ensure that this would never happen again, but it happened again. So there has been a pattern of official condemnation, then you get the diplomatic apology, but there's been no structural change, which is why this keeps happening. Now, what is happening now, or what has happened now in Mossel Bay, is still being investigated. So the loss of lives haven't been directly linked to xenophobia by the South African government. As mentioned, about 55 shacks were torched, some with people actually still inside them, according to local media. So you can just imagine the tensions that are going on now in Mossel Bay in South Africa, and which has to do with undocumented migrants, or claims that undocumented migrants are being employed by construction companies, or they're preferred to South African citizens. But let me quickly shift from xenophobia to the labor market in South Africa, specifically in Mossel Bay. Let's talk about the competition in the labor market. Mossel Bay is a port. It's an industrial town. So construction work is one of the few sectors where people who have relatively unskilled labor are utilized. And perception by some South Africans, be it accurate or not, has been that documented South African workers were being passed over in favor of cheaper undocumented foreign labor. South Africa, as we know, has a high unemployment rate. So there is pressure there. We have to acknowledge that pressure. And that pressure, unfortunately, needs somewhere to go. Sadly, foreign nationals, especially, again, if they're undocumented, are an easier and accessible target. And this is also politically convenient, if we're being honest. But of course, those who are even there legally are also concerned for their safety. We've seen cases where people who are legal have been targeted. And to your point, Joe, about what this could lead to, with what has happened to these Mozambicans in South Africa, even though the government again says they're still investigating, this is what, you know, this is why there has been so much alarm around the approaches, the loss of lives that could happen, the danger to people. And it is not just Mozambique. Ghana had to launch an emergency repatriation, as we mentioned, of approximately 300 of its citizens. So Ghana and saying Ghana is overreacting, no, it's because of the danger, because of how endangering this situation has become. Nigeria has also summoned South Africa's acting high commissioner and also announced its own plans to bring its citizens home. The Nigerian and Angolan ambassadors both raised formal complaints after their nationals were targeted. So countries now escalating through the African Union is a degree of pushback that South Africa has not quite faced in this way before. So it tells you how severe it is and takes me to what I keep saying. Please leave if you can. This has gone to a place that the only thing I can advise you to do is leave in the interest of your sanity and your dignity.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple things that I'll add. You know, I think one of the things that is most disturbing are the images and the videos coming out about those who are leading many of these protests, pleading with Europeans or non-African nationals to hire South Africans, as opposed to taking that same approach for other non-African nationals in country. Similarly to other countries, what you'll find is there isn't much of a distinction being made about illegal or legal migrants in terms of how people are being treated, right? The assumption is that everyone is there illegally. And that is not by all members of South African society. As I mentioned before, I know a number of people who live in South Africa who, find this behavior abhorrent. But those who are participating in these protests, in these attacks, are not taking into consideration legal status. They're just looking for someone to take out their anger on. And unfortunately, it's misdirected, as mentioned before. It should be towards the government, specific government officials, and it should be attacking specific policies and looking for reform around those policies, and then voting for members of parliament and a president who is willing to focus on those policies. Instead, they prefer to blame the foreign nationals that are African and cozy up to the foreign nationals that aren't. And that, to me, I think is a real problem. Separately from that, the idea that they've had to be repatriated, many of these folks have had to be repatriated back to their home countries, I think is a necessary next step, considering the circumstances, but it's an unfortunate one that there's been enough violence and enough threat to violence that people see that as the only viable option. This is not how Africans should be treating other Africans. In fact, it's not how Africans should be treating anyone, but specifically your neighbors. And these are artificially drawn lines, right? So people are having these issues with folks who are in an artificial border, come across an artificial border from somewhere else that was drawn by the Europeans, which most of the land is owned by the Europeans, but the anger is towards other Africans. It's sad, it's unfortunate. There's still minds that are colonized, and it shows that in some places there's a long way to go in the minds of those that are in country, for them to understand who should be the focus of their energy, not necessarily attacks, but just their energy. And I always go back to the protests in Kenya, which is really the next story. And what we see is protests erupted in Kenya following the Ruto government's approval of a US Ebola quarantine facility. You notice that in Kenya, right, every time there is something that the people are against, they take to the streets to protest the actions taken, specific policies. They do not focus on the immigrants in country, as there are many, and it's something we spoke about last week. They focus on the policies that have put them in the place that they're unhappy with. And so I really hope that South Africa gets to that point where those who are not happy with the the country's current status, we'll find a way to focus on, protesting the government of South Africa. But with that, this particular quarantine facility that the United States had been planning in Kenya at a particular base, demonstrators took to the streets and apparently started clashing with police, and unfortunately some unrest, and reportedly led to 2 people experiencing loss of life. So the protests come despite a Kenyan court order temporarily blocking the project, while President William Ruto defends the plan as a vital health partnership with Washington. The public outrage is mounting over fears that bringing infected foreign nationals into the country could spark a domestic outbreak. So the current outbreak, fueled by the rare strain of Ebola, has already claimed dozens of lives in the DRC and in neighboring Uganda. So we'll play this video, which will explain what the planned facility was to be and what happened with the protesters. So we'll play this video and we'll have some commentary on the other side.
Hundreds of young people took to the streets in the central town of Nanyuki on Monday. Now, they marched to the gates of the Laikipia Air Base, which is set to host a quarantine center for Americans exposed to Ebola. The anger was palpable as they chanted anti-Ebola slogans, blocked roads, and set fire to barricades. Reports say that 2 people died during the protest after police opened fire on demonstrators.
With the risk of loss of life in Kenya, people continue to protest because they want to see change. Very stark difference between Kenya and South Africa. I always call that out because I think it's important. Gloria, your thoughts on this particular protest and the outcome, with 2 people experiencing loss of life and the way the protest actually went?
Yeah, and this is why we keep saying when our governments get into certain partnerships, we ask questions as far as the broader implication of this, not just for that government, but for the entire continent, for the people of that land. There was a health compact that was signed in December 2025, just a few months ago. And that is actually part of, a piece of the puzzle that most coverage has not actually placed front and center, because it actually matters a lot, that compact that was signed back in December. Kenya agreed to a deal at a moment when other African nations were losing US health funding entirely with no replacement. The Ebola facility request actually came within that relationship, and Ruto's calculation, whatever one thinks of it, was almost certainly that refusing a request from a partner who had just committed $1.6 billion in health funding did not make sense politically or was not financially sustainable for Kenya. And this is why we say, as I said earlier, governments have to actually really weigh the options. They have to weigh the drawbacks when they get into certain partnerships with countries in the West. I mean, we know Ruto's position. Ruto does not care in terms of how the optics look. This was a man that's good friends with Macron, and he has told you, I don't care about the East, the West, I'm looking forward. So it doesn't matter where the partnership comes from. Kenya is not currently affected, and this is why people are protesting. Kenya is not currently affected. So saying that, or insisting rather, that Kenya should host people who have been exposed to this strain is actually a very dangerous one. Yeah, Ebola, there have been about 17 outbreaks, I think about 17 outbreaks in the DRC, but this particular strain is really dangerous. This is why there are concerns throughout the world, because it it could cause a loss of life like that. So to now have plans for a facility in partnership with Trump's administration, because you're refusing to allow US citizens who have been exposed to this virus, you don't want them to come to the US so they don't bring it home. And the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, saying during a cabinet meeting that the administration would not allow any cases of Ebola to enter the United States. All these things affect how Africa is perceived. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't help our image in any way. And of course, we're not saying that people should not be cautious, but here's the president of the United States looking out for his own people, however awkward and however unjust it seems. But can we say the same of the Kenyan president? I mean, the US has placed bans on foreign nationals and lawful permanent residents who have been in DRC, Uganda, South Sudan in the previous 21 days. So they are doing everything they can to protect their own citizens, but but Africa is the one bearing the brunt of this. And to have a bilateral agreement between Ruto and the Trump administration, and people are like, but is Kenya even close enough? You're claiming that Kenya is close enough to this. It's not, it's Kenya, you're saying it's far on one hand, and then you're saying, is Kenya really that close? Why is Kenya the site for this? Why are we using Kenya? And this is what people are protesting. Do you know what I mean? And to say that this is all part of a long-running health partnership with Washington is very concerning. The pattern that Ruto has exhibited, I mean, for people to have actually lost their lives over this case. This is the pattern we've seen with William Ruto. You steadily suppress people's voices and their rights to speak. I will never understand it. Macron, who claimed to be Pan-African, came in the country. There were protests. Of course, he's not going to acknowledge that. Why do you have a problem with people speaking? Why do you keep taking the lives of these young people who all they're doing is fighting for the sovereignty of their country? I will just never understand it, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to talk about the two different ways that the United States has handled an Ebola outbreak in the last 20 years. The current process is find a country, give them money, house American citizens who have been potentially infected in this place and put that country at risk. Previously, what has been done is 3,000 troops and health personnel sent to Africa to work on quarantine in country, to work on education, and a number of other things to ensure that it doesn't spread. So that was on 43rd president of the United States who had did that versus the 44th and the 44th, 46th? I don't know. But anyway, under a half African president, troops were sent, medical personnel were sent to the continent to really make sure that this was kept under control as much as possible and to prevent the spread, not only to the United States, but to other parts of the world. Those kinds of fundings, those kinds of programs have been completely eliminated. And so now the process is, let's just give a little bit of money to Kenya and have Kenya take on these potentially infected people and hope for the best. And I think that those two approaches are starkly different. And the approach that is in place today is absolutely the worst kind of approach that you can take. I also saw a statement from Marco Rubio that also said there are other methods, which I don't know what that meant. It was kind of an ambiguous statement. A lot of people have a lot of ideas for what they think that means. But those kinds of statements are very scary to hear. And also not having a plan in place, a real plan, as opposed to just saying, maybe we can pay a country to take a bunch of American citizens. You know, what else are you planning? Because you need to have a multipolar, multi-pronged approach to this. And it cannot just be, let's pay a country and keep all infected citizens in that one country and see what happens. Like that just can't happen. So we'll follow this closely and see what happens. It's interesting to see that, you know, the Kenyan government actually, the Kenyan Supreme Court, I think it was, struck it down. And so it seems as though that the protesters are still against the idea of it, and we will see what continues to happen over the coming weeks. Now, keeping with U.S. foreign policy, want to move on to Trump's plans to cut major U.S. visa processing embassies in Africa. As you might have remembered in previous discussions, we talked about travel bans, visa bans for specific African countries that happened over the last year and a half since this administration took office. And they're reportedly considering a major overhaul of the U.S. visa operations across Africa, reducing nearly 50 visa processing embassies and consulates to just 20 regional hubs. The proposal could force applicants from many African countries to travel abroad for interviews, significantly increasing costs and delays. Now, remember, you do not get your money back when you apply for a visa. It's already difficult for many people to apply for visa and go to the embassy to get that appointment. And, you know, because as someone who's made appointments on the embassy website, it's very difficult. And then also to then have to travel to another country is next level. So the move comes as there's a broader tightening of U.S. immigration policies, including higher security and visa bond requirements for certain travelers. Critics argue that Washington is making legal migration harder, even as it seeks to deeper engagement with African governments. The plan could reshape how millions of Africans access the United States in the years ahead. So we'll play this video and we'll have some commentary on the other side. One second.
The United States still wants African partners, Washington minerals, and it still wants to compete with China and Russia across the continent. But many Africans may soon find it far harder to even apply for a US visa. According to an internal US State Department memo cited by the Associated Press, the Trump administration is considering a major overhaul of visa operations across Africa. Reports suggest that nearly 50 visa processing posts could be consolidated into just 20 regional hubs. Under the proposal, full visa services would continue in key cities, including Lagos, Nairobi, Accra, Addis Ababa, Kampala, Dakar, Johannesburg, and Kinshasa. But applicants in many other African countries could be required to travel abroad to complete US visa interviews.
Apologies. So your thoughts on this story, Gloria?
Yeah, so Abuja, which is Nigeria's capital and political center, is not on the list. Only Lagos is. Countries like Madagascar, the Central African Republic, Lesotho, Eswatini, Burundi, they're losing visa processing entirely at their home embassies. So this new system now means an international trip just to apply for a visa. The cost of traveling now to a hub city, the cost of booking a hotel, you're taking time off work, you're paying the application fee before you even know if you will be approved, is a barrier that will functionally price out everyone except those who have crazy money, except the relatively wealthy people. Visa processing in Africa has already been affected by a travel ban on certain countries, as we know. What started as a pilot program in August of last year that required citizens of Malawi and Zambia to post bonds of up to $15,000 when they apply for tourist and business visas has now expanded. Of 38 countries required to post visa bonds globally, 24 are in Africa. Another 12 African countries are subject to outright travel bans. Of course, you know the Sahel. Countries like the Sahel have been targeted. And when you add these categories together, more than half of Africa's 54 countries are either fully banned from the US or they're required to post a 5-figure cash deposit just to apply for a standard visitor visa, with no guarantee of approval no guarantee of getting their money back in a timely way if the visa is in fact denied. And what has the justification be that there has been visa overstay and there have been deficiencies with the screening process? Trump told us who he was before he got into office, if we're being fair to Trump. Trump said the things he would do. And it's the things he's doing, the things he said he would do, that he's doing. And I don't have a problem with people's political positions when it comes to the continent. But as we've discussed, and I've even done a poll and I've seen it, we have a lot of Africans who truly support this man. So in supporting him, at this point, I guess the solution now is for everyone to push for sovereignty of their nations so that we can all just be in our countries. Joe can move back to Sierra Leone or maybe stay in Ghana. I can go back to Nigeria. Everybody go back to, because at this point, I don't know what else to say. At this point, it's let's just keep pushing for the sovereignty of Africa. And this is why a show like this is very important, because we have to fight for our countries back. This is ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. I think, look, there's a lot of reasons why people want to go to the United States. And we do obviously have our thoughts about how sometimes U.S. foreign policy can be detrimental to folks in other countries. And we always have to be careful about how we communicate these things because of, how sensitive the federal government of the United States is these days. But I think it is really important to be clear that, for many, there is this potential dream of an opportunity. And it has been the country that has always welcomed, well, it hasn't always welcomed immigrants. Sorry, it has always had large influxes of immigrants, I should say. It's almost never welcomed immigrants, actually. Except when the Native Americans were more welcoming and learned the hard way that the people that they welcome weren't the kind of people you want to welcome. But generally, they've never been welcoming to migrants. But it's always been a country that's been built on migrants, whether forcefully taken from their lands or people who voluntarily came to the country. I think that, these same policies, it reminds me of the same things we're seeing in South Africa with the Afrophobia, right? This belief system that these other people who are coming here are the problem, as opposed to focusing on the people who are implementing these policies. So in any case, I think it's important to call that out. We will see what happens if this goes from 50 down to 20. That'd be a huge change. As you saw in West Africa, that would mean Sierra Leone. Sierra Leoneans would have to travel to either Abidjan or to Accra, Ghana, to be able to apply for a visa to go to the United States. That's also the same for Liberia, for Guinea, and for many of those neighboring countries. Benin and Togo would have to travel across borders. So, it was a very light map. It's 54 countries. There's 50 places today. Now you're dropping that to 20. So just think about how that would, really hinder the process. And what they don't realize is how much African immigrants are needed in the United States. That's a conversation for another time, but we will follow this story closely, and we'll see if this proposal actually comes to fruition. In the interest of time, we're going to skip the story about Ghana vowing to never need to beg the IMF for money. We saw that they finished paying off that last loan. But next, we want to jump into UAE buying half of Zimbabwe's total exports. I think this is important because we will see many more stories like this as the United States continues with this conflict in Iran, right? I think folks who were focused on their natural resources in terms of oil and gas have now started to look elsewhere. And they have been already, in terms of looking at national resources across the continent of Africa. But I think now this is even accelerating it more, and it's forcing their hand more at different kinds of deals. But it's a monumental shift in global commerce. It's completely rewritten the economic map of Southern Africa as the UAE officially dethroned South Africa as Zimbabwe's largest export destination. So Dubai's status a premier hub and their president, the UAE, absorbs 50% of Zimbabwe's entire gold exports. Official data reveals that out of 2.78 billion in Q1 exports, nearly 1.4 went directly to the Gulf nation of the United Arab Emirates. So while gold remains the undisputed king of this relationship, the trade also encompasses critical minerals like lithium and nickel alongside high-value agricultural products. So we're going to play a video from African First Post, and we will have some comment on the other side.
Our last story is from Southern Africa. A quiet but big shift in global trade has taken place, and the economic map of Zimbabwe has been completely rewritten. The United Arab Emirates has officially dethroned South Africa as Zimbabwe's largest export destination. Right now, the UAE is buying half of everything Zimbabwe exports to the world. Let's break down the numbers that are turning heads in the financial world. According to the latest data from the Zimbabwe National Statistics Agency, in the first quarter of this year, Zimbabwe exported goods worth nearly $2.78 billion globally. And half of those goods, worth nearly $1.4 billion, went straight to the UAE. To put this growth into perspective, total trade between the two nations crossed the $5 billion mark last year. By the end of this year, officials expect that number to shatter records and to pass the $6 billion mark. So, how did the UAE replace South Africa at the top of the leaderboard? The short answer is gold, powered by a new diplomatic push. Under President Emmerson Mnangagwa's engagement and re-engagement policy, Zimbabwe has actively looked for new global partners. But at the same time, Dubai has positioned itself as the world's premier gateway for precious metals.
Dubai is the world's premier gateway for precious metals. If you just heard that last statement, just think about that, where they don't have precious metals underground. So they're all coming from the continent of Africa. So there's a lot of incentives to be involved in a lot of conflicts on the continent of Africa, which has been widely reported and alleged. But your thoughts on the UAE expanding their business presence on the continent with over 50% of the gold exports from Zimbabwe?
Yeah. Did you ever see that documentary on the Zimbabwe gold mafia? I think that was back in 2023. There was an investigation that happened with Al Jazeera. I highly recommend. In fact, I'm going to rewatch it because that just gives you perspectives that make this story quite concerning. And of course, when I saw the headlines of the story, one of the first thoughts that came to my mind was, of course, Sudan. Do we exactly have closure with Sudan? What has the UAE said about the, let me call them allegations that have come out from Sudan, with gold, as we've all found out, being at the center of these very awful acts that happened in Sudan. And Sudan is still at war as we speak. But when you think about Zimbabwe and this partnership that is going on, at first read, it looks like great news for Zimbabwe, but then it gets more complicated the deeper you go. According to data from the Zimbabwe National Statistics Agency, Zimbabwe exported goods worth approximately $1.4 billion to the UAE between January and March of this year alone. This represents 50% of Zimbabwe's total exports of $2.775 billion during that quarter. So you're having total bilateral trade exceeding $5 billion in 2025, and it's actually projected to surpass $6 billion by the end of this year. South Africa and China followed, each taking about 19% of Zimbabwe's export earnings, which means that these three markets together absorb nearly 89% of Zimbabwe's exports just by value. So when you have a single partner that takes half of everything that you sell to the world, I wouldn't call that, it's not a thing of, it's not, I wouldn't see that as flattering. I don't think it's about a trade preference. This is structural dependency that I'm concerned, as far as what that translates to, as far as the people of Zimbabwe. So whether that dependency is currently serving Zimbabwe's interest, whether it will continue to serve their interest, I think is the main brow raising part of this entire story, because we know gold is the engine. The fact that gold essentially equals the entire UAE export figure is, there's no coincidence there. The UAE and gold are inseparable, as we know. When you think of Sudan, the UAE prioritizes gold. They make a ton of money from gold. And here's what Dubai actually does with African gold, because the UAE produces no gold of its own. So its model is based on importing gold from countries that do produce gold. They refine, they certify it, then they re-export it globally to international markets. So Dubai is home to at least 20 gold refineries and more than 7,000 traders in precious metals and stones. That is a ton of money. It actually overtook the UK as of 2023. So they don't play about their gold. But what we don't get enough of, because once you have refined that gold, you can't trace it back to its source. This is why there's been a lot of gold smuggling, and even people's lives have been endangered because Dubai is not playing about its gold. I don't think I should say more than I've said so far.
Yeah, and you said it all. Look, I think that there's a couple of things that I would add, and just one thing that I would add is follow the money, right? Follow the money. That's what we always say when it comes to these kinds of things, and pay attention to how one conflict changed the behaviors of other people. This conflict with Iran has really accelerated things, and we will see a lot more stories like this. This was not the first kind of deal of its sort. It's not even a deal. It was just the purchasing that happened, right? So it's not the first of its sort. That'll probably solidify deals. There will be more of these kinds of things. Those things will not change because these countries are looking for ways to bring people in. Dubai, at one point, their hotels were seeing 80 to 90% occupancy. Because of the bombings, etc., that occupancy has dropped to somewhere between 30, 40, sometimes even 20% in these hotels. Travel to Dubai is way down. And, it's an economy that was artificially propped up by, a number of different people coming into country and finding it as a destination to be able to be at. But now, they're looking for ways to expand on what they had previously by offering natural resources found on the continent of Africa. So we will see how this continues to grow. I don't anticipate that this will slow down. I expect that other countries in the Gulf region will be involved, and I expect that more countries on the continent of Africa will be seeing more of their minerals bought by countries in the Gulf. So we'll pay attention to it. We'll keep you guys posted and abreast of what's happening. And, we'll make sure that you guys are aware. With just a couple of minutes left, I think we could do a high level look at a couple of stories before we bring this thing to a close. But I do want to mention that, Senegal president, Faye has not only ousted the prime minister, as you guys saw, and he actually has a new position in government, but he's now named an entire new government of 30 new officials after ousting the prime minister. In the interest of time, since we can't go into the video and watch it, do you have any thoughts on this particular story with the 30 new members of cabinet named just within 2 weeks or 1 week after firing the prime minister, feeling like there was already a plan to do so?
It was last week we talked about the firing of the prime minister, and that had happened just a few days before. So it's been a little over a week. And I guess Faye definitely means business, because that was quick. But I am consoled by the fact that Sonko is at least, the National Assembly Speaker. So we will continue to hear from him. But I do think that the election of Senegal is going to be very interesting, the next election. Don't you, Joe?
Very interesting. Yeah.
And I also want to add that there are some Pastef members, that's Sonko's party that he founded, that brought him, that brought Faye into power. There are some members who are, who have shown loyalty to Faye, some to Sonko. So because I think some are part of the cabinet ministers, it's going to be really interesting because it's been a test of loyalty through and through, hasn't it? I think it's a very interesting time to be Senegalese right now. Not to minimize influence, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll watch closely and we'll keep you guys posted. I have a lot to say, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it. Also, Niger targets Algeria route to unlock Sahel uranium after France fallout. So Niger is accelerating plans to rebuild its uranium industry after breaking with France and revoking the licenses of French nuclear giant Orano. So the military government has reaffirmed support for the Dassa uranium project, one of Africa's highest grade uranium deposits, as it searches for a new export routes across the Sahel. So with traditional trade corridors through Benin blocked after the coup and security threats disrupting alternatives through West Africa, Niger is now exploring a new Algeria-linked corridor to the Mediterranean ports. This move could reshape regional geopolitics, strengthen Algeria's influence in the Sahel, and turn Niger into a major symbol of resource nationalization in Africa. Your thoughts?
I am for it, as long as ultimately it favors the people who own the land. I absolutely am for it. We've always been about, let me not throw Joe into this by force, but the ability to partner among ourselves, I'm all for it, as long as it's properly done. So yay to Niger.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's necessary. I mean, that's almost like a north-south or north or sub-Saharan Africa alliance. We need to see more of it. So we'll see what this turns into, but we will continue to watch and keep you guys posted. Now, with the end of the live stream coming to a close, we just want to say thank you all who watched. There's a lot of people engaging in the comments. Sorry we couldn't get to you guys. There were a lot of stories we wanted to try to get through before the day was done. Make sure you follow Gloria at the Gloria AO and at Diaspora Station. Follow our platforms at Authentic African across all platforms. If you're interested in getting a weekly newsletter about news, investing, moving, etc., sign up for our email list at insights.authenticaafrican.com. The link is also in the description below. And also you can join our collective where you get access to all the resources that I make available for all the things that I do here on the continent. That's, internet installers, that's plumbers, electricians, etc. And so if you're interested in all that stuff, taxi drivers, lawyers, you can sign up for the collective and we'll give you access to all of them. With that, I want to thank everybody for watching. Any final thoughts, Gloria, before we go?
Thank you all so much. We appreciate you. Kimmy, Phoenix, thank you for your love and your contributions. And of course, everyone else who has been showing us love. We, like Joseph, wish we could acknowledge every single person, but we appreciate you immensely. Thank you.
All right. With that, guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys all next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.